Hi,
Hello there, how are you? Well
I'm
done.
good.
Excellent. Just a reminder, we're streaming on YouTube even. No idea if anyone's listening, but they did last time, so hopefully they're back. And we're
I
going to
hope
start
so.
recording
I
in a
hope
minute.
so.
Anyway, good to see you. You've got a new Mac.
I have, and looking forward to showing you the
a physical
work
audience
this time in its completion.
Wave to students who are actually at the RCA.
Hi, RCA students. I was there about 20 years ago.
Excellent. Should have a few more coming in. I'll go round.
What floor are you on? What floor are you on?
We're in the ground floor if you come in from the Albert Hall side.
Oh yeah,
so
that's the gallery.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's right. And then most recently it was fashion, and they built these kind of booths everywhere.
I see.
So you get 6 people in a booth, but actually suits us really well.
Is that a coronavirus thing?
Yeah, it is.
Oh, okay.
So we're allowed in for 2 weeks.
I see. What floor are you usually on?
We're not even in this building normally. We're over in Stevens on the other side. You know, the newish building they built across the Mews, and we normally have 2.5 floors of that.
Yeah. I know.
Yeah, good. It was nice actually. Last year, the second years got into what had been the automotive studio, Intelligent Mobility, which has beautiful windows. But they were only there a few months, obviously.
Yeah.
And then it all stopped.
Yeah.
So I haven't got a mask on because I'm talking to you. Go on.
Yeah. I've been talking to a few education people. Everyone's in the same boat. But actually, amazing how well everyone has adapted. I think enormous recognition for flexibility on everyone's part.
I couldn't agree more. It's been incredible. I think it's probably a bit easier for us in service design because we used to only have Sharpies and Post-its. And we don't use the workshops that much. We quite like it when we do. And now we've got Miro boards and social media and TikTok, you name it, we're using it.
Yeah, that's a good point because many of the people I'm talking to don't need to use the workshops.
No, that's all right. I think if you're a textile designer, it's probably a little bit more miserable.
Yeah, totally.
Hello, textile designers, if anybody's watching.
Yes, we're thinking about you.
So I'm trying to see if I've got a record button, which I haven't. Which is a bit weird.
We're live anyway, so does it go out?
So here we go, record to the cloud. Let's try that. Record this meeting. There you go. Great. I hope they've changed that voice. I think we should have a less American, more pluralistic option of voices.
Sounded quite roboty as well.
It is, isn't it? It is. Okay, so it's 2 minutes past. We'll just give people a couple of minutes because you know how people are, especially at lunchtime. We've got 35 actual students. I can't see who we've got on YouTube, but it's brilliant to have it on YouTube because everyone can go and access it. And there's an amazing bunch of talks through the Summer's Festival of Better Ideas and all the bits around the show. They're all on our YouTube site. So anybody who's interested in service design, go and listen to them all. They're amazing. You could spend the whole weekend, better than a box set.
Sounds brilliant.
You've got a bit of a nice curtain behind you now, Joe.
I have. I've had to soundproof and do some other bits. So I've been working because pretty much all my business was jumping on flights and going to do a talk or a training or conferences. So everything's like everyone else. I've had to adapt as well. And we also moved into a new place, which is all flat, hard wooden floors, hard walls, and the sound's atrocious. So this is an
acoustically terrible.
Yeah,
visually beautiful. Acoustically terrible. I get you. Or have you seen the other innovation? We've actually put up a holding slide this time, which feels like an innovation to me.
Yes, yes, excellent innovation.
But Service Design TV has already been mentioned to the Dean as an amazing thing, that we're actually broadcasting our practitioner talks for the whole world to see. Only they knew.
I thought it was it's surprising how few other, when I talk to other educational institutions, very few are really using social media. I know a couple are, but it's really good to see you working with it.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot more to come.
Yeah,
I think there's
definitely
a lot we can do, and it's brilliant for, well, you know, a lot of our job is to actually let the world know service design exists, full stop, you know. And
yes,
we have a chief science officer. When are we going to have a chief design officer standing next to him or her, next to Boris?
Yeah.
That's what we want.
Yeah, probably not
Anyway.
in this context, because I don't know if we'd add anything to it right now.
I don't know. Track and trace is not a success.
No, actually, that's very true. There's a lot of failures in a service sense at the moment.
Yeah, I'll shut up now. And let's sort of launch proceedings. Thank you for coming back, Joe, and talking to us again.
Thank you for inviting me back again.
Welcome to 43 students, and I'm sure there'll be a few more in a minute. And welcome to anybody who's watching on our YouTube live stream or the recording of this talk, which is available to the entire world. So I'm going to hand over to Joe, who's been an inspiration to me throughout his life. He's going to tell you who he is, but I'm really delighted he's come back to talk about both himself and the book he wrote called End. So Joe, over to you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Right, I'm just going to move on to the deck. So as we tried last time, so Clive asked me to share a bit about who am I? So who is Joe? So I come from humble beginnings. I'm quite old, 1972 I was born, and I'm son of a plumber and a nurse, and I'm dyslexic. Pretty much most of the building you're in will be dyslexic. Dyslexics are found in prisons first and then art colleges. So that gives you some impression of what it's like. Education, really basic and terrible when I was younger. But I got really into design, and that really saved me. I was there in the first web boom, and which was crazy and reckless, and it crashed. And I experienced the fallout of that. I got into mobile quite early on. I really enjoyed that. I designed mobile games. So this is a gigantic mobile gaming thing we built for a big .com business, and it was like we spent £250,000 building it, and then I went off and done all sorts of weird text messaging games. I worked for companies like Orange on service design ideas and how stuff will work. I moved over to Nokia, which was a lot more hardware centric when I first moved there, but we introduced a lot of prototyping skills and more sort of service design stuff, which was a lot of fun, done packaging type things there. So I was stretched around doing all sorts of design types things, whether it be physical, digital, graphical, interactive or service, typographical here. And these are some of the earlier concepts. This was before the iPhone came out, this type of thing, or just around that time. So we had ideas about that, but couldn't quite get them out. I moved over to a company called Us2, which some of you might know from a game called Monument Valley. But we were a pretty big business. By the time I left, there was 250 of us over 4 countries. We were in London, New York, Malmo in southern Sweden, and Tokyo, and actually Australia as well. When I left, these are some of the clients we had. So we'd work with them, lots of fun. This is the Monument Valley. When it first came out, it won loads of awards, but they've done a few iterations since. It was a massive game and made the company stacks of money. And lots of kudos as well. It was wonderful. Done other different types of ventures and stuff. I also got involved in a sort of a campaign. I got involved in politics for like 2 years of my life while I'm still doing this. And we gathered together all of the design industry. Clive helped us quite a bit actually with his contacts. And we started building this campaign to keep the quality, belief and the value of design inside core education, as the Conservatives were trying dragging that out and devaluing it. Very interesting. And then I left there and started looking into this endings thing. And so let me just dive out of that and start on endings. This is the second phase of this two-parter presentation today. So let's look at this. So ends. We are all going to die. Historically, we were a lot more comfortable with that. But over generations, we started to distance ourselves from talking about it and experiencing or witnessing death. So it's been pushed away behind the scenes. And we sort of mimicked this in our consumer experiences. We have moved away from the end of the consumer product lifecycle, sort of creating a bias in consumerism. At the start of that consumer journey, it's a rich, beautiful, curated, well thought through experience for the consumer. And at usage, it's smooth, well designed, well executed. But at the end, it's really overlooked. It's this instant disposability. It has no meaning. It has no instructional purpose for the consumer experience. We're very lost in this thing. And it actually goes back ever such a long time. But let me give you an example what I mean by an ending, so with a modern ending. It's a printer ink cartridge. My printer runs out of ink every 5 minutes, it seems. So I go out, I buy a new printer ink cartridge, and I sit there as I take the old one out and put the new one. I was sitting there with an old printer ink cartridge thinking, what should I do with this? And you look on the back of the packaging, and there's 2 other marketing messages on there, but no instruction of what to do at the end of this consumer life cycle. Despite me knowing that this is a very poisonous, toxic thing, and you really shouldn't chuck it in landfill, but how do you recycle it? Anyway, no instruction. I didn't know what to do. So like any normal person, I go online and I find out this company has been doing a really good recycling reclaiming program for 20 odd years. But in this context, I didn't know about it. But if I filled in this form and gave up some of my personal details and agreed to some terms and conditions, they'd send me an envelope. And a few days later, this envelope arrived, and I put the printer ink cartridge in the envelope, and then I go up to the post office and I take that back to the post office. And it probably takes 2 days to get back to them. So this thing's taken 5 days to offboard this consumer experience. It was detached from the rest of the experience. I was uninstructed. I was abandoned. I didn't know what to do. And this type of thing is happening across the consumer life cycle, whether it's in products, services, or digital. But my assumption when I first looked into it is that it's some sort of business savvy, hard-nosed business logic that makes this thing happen. But actually it goes way deeper. It's deep in our sort of social context of the way we've built consumer society. So let's look back in history. Imagine yourself in the 16th century. It's cold, it's grim, you're hungry, impoverished. Your life is really hard, but you know a lot about this subject, death. You're quite comfortable with death. Death is quite familiar to you. You talk about death, you see it as a natural part of life, and you're guided through that with your religion. And there's the other side of death, you can get to a place called heaven. In most religions have some sort of version of heaven. But to get there, you need to go through strict religious protocol and rules, one of which is funerals. The way we die has to be specifically adhered to. Otherwise, you end up in a place called purgatory, or you don't offboard life properly. But once the plague arrived in Europe, this decimated this sort of simple process, this simple rule system. The plague upset this, this logic around it. And when it arrived in 1348, it decimated Europe. It killed a third of Europe's population within 3 years. Death became very meaningless at this point. Death was everywhere, and no one could really understand what was going on. The dominant religion at the time was the Catholic religion, and they really mismanaged it. They, as well as giving out things called indulgences, which are sort of jail-free cards for rich people, they were also, a lot of them were dying because of the plague. Their service personnel, as it were dying en masse. So this disrupted a lot. And there's these new challenger religions came along, one of which was the Protestants. Now, the Protestants had some different views of how we should live our lives back then, one of which was fasting. Now, most religions around the world have a period of fasting where you will remove yourself from the abundance of life and you will reflect upon how lucky you are and give thanks at that point. So thinking of Ramadan and other fasting periods. Easter had one in the Catholic calendar, but Martin Luther removed fasting from the religious calendar of the Protestants, which was dominated Northern Europe at the time, which also happened to be this beginning place of the Industrial Revolution. And there's a linkage here that I'd like to highlight to you. Another aspect of the Protestants was jobs. So in the Protestant religion, you could value your job. In the Catholic religion, there was only 3 good jobs, which was a pope, a priest, and a nun. All other jobs were pretty standard. But in the eyes of God, in the Protestant religion, jobs, whether you be an engineer, an interaction designer, a service designer, or whatever else you want to be, it was valued in the eyes of God. And this changed mindsets quite a lot in terms of personal well-being as well. And then investment was also changed in the eyes of God in the Protestant religion. These 3 things start to echo through the centuries, and they end up in the Industrial Revolution, laying the foundations for in a massive consumer consumption. So let's look at the Industrial Revolution and what the consumer experience was around there. Previously to the Industrial Revolution, you had a very simple affair with consumption. The waste from the kitchen table would be given to the animals. The waste from the animals would be put on the land, and the abundance and harvest from the land would come back to the kitchen table to be consumed. It was a circle of consumption. It was visible, it was understandable, and it was actionable to people of pre-industrial times. And they had this circle of consumption they could control and understand. The Industrial Revolution changed that circle. It turned it into a linear narrative. And over centuries, since the Industrial Revolution, we've been splitting this beginning from end. And this really started with an acceleration of consumption. We defined the benefits of consumerism through marketing way more. We set up things called department stores. We started to sell the dream. Advertising became this incredibly powerful tool. But at the same time, we started distancing ourselves from the understanding waste and the idea of waste and responsibility of waste. So you see things like germs, which are invisible. They're considered to be waste, and they will kill you if you get germs inside you, for example. And this type of story, a thing which is invisible waste, it will get to you and it will kill you. That sort of that relationship with waste, where it's this repulsive, distant, invisible thing, sinister thing, comes back again and again. So you get it with the boom of domestic sort of cleaning products in the 50s are recognized in that type of relationship with waste. But we also tell that story in terms of nuclear waste and the distance, and we're telling it again with climate change. It's a distant, invisible thing that we're creating, but we don't know how to stop it, and it's going to get us and it's going to kill us. So we start to split the consumer experience beginning from end, untethering that relationship. But why do emotional endings at all? In fact, we've been telling things like stories for millennia. Stories are vital in communicating before the written word, but communicating how something was done, educating different people over generations. We would tell stories, and the end of that story was vital and critical to the wider purpose of it, education previously. But now we look at stories about their endings. So this is Elizabeth MacArthur. She's a film critic, and she talks about endings. Endings in narratives attempts to preserve the moral and social order which would be threatened by endlessly airing narratives. And I think of that in terms of the 2008 financial crash and how many people lost their homes in that period and are now experiencing an endlessly airing narrative to their lives and their financial lives. Another one, this is Richard Newport, and he says, solid closure in conventional narratives and histories satisfies individual and social desire for moral authority, purposeful interpretation of life, and genuine stability. And I think of that in terms of how we can't get out of this relationship with carbon, and we can't say the end of carbon and have that relationship with the ending of it. We've disrupted that interpretation of life and creating an incredible instability in the long run. There's obviously lots of psychology around endings, stacks of it related to death, but and I could go on about that for hours, but I just wanted to bring up one which I find really interesting. This is by Ernest Becker. He wrote a book called Denial of Death. Oh, incredibly ironically, he died before it was published, almost like Bowie's last bit of work. So he died before the book was published. His wife published it, and it ended up winning the Booker Prize that year. 1973, I think this was. So he proposed in it this thing called terror management theory. And terror management theory is this life experience where you think you have this subconscious terror of death. And throughout your life, you're trying to create a life project which will outlive you. And so you do things like try to write a book, for example, or try to change a law and do something in bigger purpose, so making sculpture, etc., etc. This has been tested many times, and so one of these things is terror management theory. It was tested around consumerism. Kasser and Sheldon in 2000, they asked a group of people together, there's about 12 people, for example, and they split the groups into two sections. They asked one side of the group to listen to jazz and the other side of the group to think about their own mortality, so thinking about death. And then they would ask people about what they think about consumerism and how powerful their consumer ability will be for the following years. And what they found was the aggression by the people who have been thinking about their own death, their own mortality, was significantly stronger, and the purpose to purchase things and their perception of being able to purchase more and more and more. Super fascinating. So that past section was in the last book, and in the last book I went into a lot more of the psychology, history, and sociological sort of aspects of endings and why we can't do them in modern consumerism. So the next book, which is coming out next year, called Engineering, which is for people who want to design endings. And so I'm going to go into that type of stuff now. And the stuff I'm trying to get out of it, what's the intent of designing these types of endings, as it were? So trying to create an opportunity that we build sort of reflective experiences that encourage people to take responsibility, make actionable change, and improve the enormous ills of consumption that we've currently got. And these aren't just things around physical pollution. This is across physical, digital, and service sectors. The same type of disrespect for endings is apparent across all of them. And I want to define it a little bit more in terms of that intent. So splitting it into a business intent and a consumer intent. So with the business culture, trying to change that business culture to reflect upon consumer endings a little bit more. What we try and do is create this open conversation in a business that inspires collaborative effort between the consumer and the provider, and in actively controlling and concluding the life of a product. So what do you mean a bit about this, Joe? So let's get into it in a bit more detail. I'll give you some examples. This is an open conversation. What do we mean about that? And it's having the ability and the strength to talk about the end of the consumer lifecycle. And I think Ries talks about this in Lean Startup, about this, the fear of not ending. So there is no bigger destroyer of creative potential than misguided decisions to preserve. This mindset that we're going to just keep going the way we are instead of opening up these bigger discussions. And also in that business, you need to inspire collaborative effort. So a company which I think is really good at inspiring collaborative effort between the consumer and the provider is a company called Fairphone. They build phones which are easy to dismantle, open up, change the battery, change the camera, and they're an inspiration to a lot of companies. And they're, I think, brave enough to go into a marketplace that's dominated by enormous companies which are making super slim phones that we basically are dead within 4 years. And then actively concluding in terms of ending the product or service digital experience. And I think Patagonia are really good at this. They've started to discuss that thing with their consumers. They are embracing the idea of inviting consumers back to have a conversation about the end of that product. Can we renew it? Can we reclaim it? And what should we do with it at the end? When I talk about the end and when I've been researching it, I've attempted to synthesize down some big fundamental problems at the end of the consumer life cycle that are the sort of foundation of the problems, really. I believe these go into these 4 categories. These 4 things happen at the end of the consumer life cycle that stop us dealing with the problems with consumerism. So number 1 is the relationship between the provider and the consumer breaks. And once that breaks, it becomes very hard to put responsibility on groups. The other thing is the asset definition lost. And what I mean by that is that the asset from, say, a plastic container or a piece of cloth or textile, or whether it be the some data, these things, once they get over the point of the ending, the asset has lost definition. In the physical products, it gets chucked into amongst other assets, and the definition of it is lost amongst loads of other things. And the same things tends to happen with data as well. So once that gets chucked into massive data lists, that bit of data becomes quite lost in terms of its definition. The third thing is actors and actions are anonymized, meaning that when a consumer done something, or when a company done something at the beginning of the consumer life cycle through that phase, at the end, they start to get anonymized and they become distant. So there's no identity attached to these items. So for example, in physical products, when I chuck something in the waste, my relationship with that is from ownership to taxpayer instantly. So I become the taxpayer that's putting up with the waste system and society. And then routes to neutralizing are blurred. So when I want to, for example, with a printer ink cartridge, how do I end this in a proper way? That is very blurred at the end of the consumer life cycle. And we don't have very clear avenues which have been packaged in an interpretable way for the consumer. And this also happens with data, where you're told your data, as you break off a relationship, is protected, but there's consequences then selling on your data to third parties that you have no direct contact with. So these are 4 fundamentals which are really established the problems with consumerism at the end of the consumer life cycle. I want to bring up sustainability and put this in terms of consumerism and the consumer life cycle in the end. We, as a society, as a consumer society, we have been selling the new thing in the same way for hundreds of years. This product is new. It's made from new materials. and new processes, and it's a new product and you should buy it. And this is often packaged up as you should buy it because your life will be better in the future, or something will be better in the future. Now, with many of the new products coming along in the circular economy or in sustainability, a lot of them have promised this experience of a better future if we only buy this new product. And that's a great intent, I think. And there's lots of benefits to that. We've seen all sorts of improvements to product delivery and development. But it is a generic, purposeless, and it also doesn't bring up personal responsibility really at the end and the consequence of consumption. Cradle to Cradle, the book by William McDowell, Michael Brambett, I think is a really good example of this mismanaged thing about like when we're going to create new stuff that you can buy more of. And as you can see from this quote about can be overtly good, this arrogance about this, we're going to carry on the same mindset that we've got about consumption, and we're not going to really reflect about the bigger issue of poor endings. And we also see it in the circular economy stuff. When I talk to people about circular economy, and we go onto the Ellen MacArthur website, which is like a cornerstone of the circular economy community, very little mention about the consumer life cycle, and how marketing really tells stories about these things. And this, I think, is a really big mismatch. I'm not belittling any of the amazing work that's been done, but I think in the absence of a consumer being involved in this part of this important system, this important discussion, I think it's really challenging. And corporate social responsibility does the same thing. Buy this, we'll do better if you buy more stuff with us, etc. And lastly, I want to, on this particular section, I want to talk about plastics in the sea. Plastics in the sea, I think, is a really disorientating relationship. It distances the consumer from the relationship of waste, and it turns it into a bigger societal problem, which it is. But if we don't acknowledge the problem with the end of the consumer life cycle, we're going to carry on talking about plastics in the sea as a material problem. And the longer it's a material problem, the less we're going to be able to close that off inside the consumer life cycle, instead of it, in my mind, plastics in the sea is a problem with the end of the consumer life cycle, where it's broken out of the consumer experience into the wider environment. So to summarize on this sustainability bit, if we carry on telling this story about doing good by proxy to all consumers in the same type of way, we're not going to get to resolve the problem. And what we need to do with sustainability is encourage people to look back at the end, take personal responsibility, and challenge consumption and make actionable change. Okay, let's move on to the wider consumer experience. So I've done lots of work around the consumer experience and endings, and I'm going to get to that in 1 minute after wetting my lips for a minute. Okay. Endings can be created across the consumer life cycle, and it's important to think it's not just something to knock on or add on at the end. You need to frame the end throughout the consumer journey. And let's come back to the intent of this. So the intent for the business we heard about earlier, and now let's dig into the intent for the consumer. So the intent for the consumer, we should be creating experiences that are consciously connected to the rest of the experience through emotional triggers that are actionable by the consumer in a timely manner. Okay, let's dig into those. Consciously connected, beginning to end. Well, IKEA is a good example of this. IKEA, incredibly successful company, and they filled our homes up with stuff. We've got loads of IKEA stuff filling our houses up. And until IKEA start removing that stuff, it's going to be hard for any of us to buy more IKEA stuff. And they're doing that now. They're starting to do reclaiming, recycling, removal programs. So they'll come to your place, pick up your old stuff. And they're also doing stuff where you take in your old products into the IKEA store now as well. And that helps us make, if you're going to make the consumer experience more connected, beginning to end, it helps by removing from someone else's problem to it being accountable. Okay, is it emotional? I don't know if any of you have seen Marie Kondo's work on saying at the end of the product life cycle. Marie Kondo's a declutterer from Japan. She goes into people's houses and she helps declutter their house. And she'll get them to pick up all of their things and put them into piles so you can see what you want and what you want to keep. And she gets people at the end with the pile of stuff you want to throw away to pick up every item and say, thank you. Thank you, comfortable walking boots, for allowing me to walk up the hill. You've done your job now, and now it's time to say goodbye. Which sounds crazy to a lot of Westerners, but for Marie Kondo in her work, but her work echoes a lot of stuff around Shinto Buddhism, which is one of the only religious practices that says goodbye to products like they have a life. They have a sort of a life within themselves. That helps bringing that emotion into it. It moves it from being indifference about that experience to being engaged in it. And that's sort of what we need to do a lot more at the end of the consumer life cycle. Is it actionable? So this symbol on the back of all consumer electronic products that are sold in the EU, and you'll see it almost everywhere. It says to the consumer, don't throw it in the bin. But can anyone do don't? It's unactionable. You can't do don't. I can't do don't at the weekend, for example. You can't do don't. So not throwing it in the bin, what option do you have? You have to have an actionable option at the end of the consumer life cycle. And if you have something that's actionable, it moves it from circle of concern, making something actionable, moves it to the circle of influence, so you can do something about it. Is it timely? This is Kaya cars. Around 10, 12 years ago, they introduced this thing called the 7-year warranty, and it has been enormously successful to them. At the time, everyone was doing like a 2-year warranty, but Kaya cars came in with a 7-year warranty, incredible big market disruption. And with that, it changed people's attitudes about stuff. It took it from being this product to being a relationship. Now people buy, customers of Kaya cars, consider the 7-year warranty above every other aspect of the consumer experience, whether it be price point or design, etc. Now, the interesting thing about 7 years is humans find it hard to think beyond 5 years. So that's why you'll get those cliche job interview questions of like, what you're going to be doing in 5 years' time, or investment questions. 7 years is this a bit too far. It's a bit too hard to think about. It's like this void, this death-like void that the product falls into. And so when somebody drives back onto a product, a forecourt with a Kaya car now, they have this great conversation, a rich conversation about the renewal of the next product instead of just this product relationship. And it moves it out of this, this inaction, this lingering thing of the relationship, to having context and closure, having an end date. Right, let's lighten the mood with a bit of lifetime guarantees. This is one of the funniest things I've investigated when you really dig into lifetime guarantees. So a couple of years ago, in 2018, Domino's Pizza in Russia brought out this thing. They promised their customers in Russia on Twitter, they said, if you get a tattoo of Domino's Pizza on your body, somewhere visible, we'll give you free pizza for life. And then all of their followers in Russia started to go at it. Loads of people started getting Domino Pizza tattoos. And you can see them here. Obviously, this didn't last long because I guess and I assume that Domino's Pizza Global said, "What on earth are you doing? You need to shut that down immediately." And then, so they had to shut this thing down about.
Okay, it looks like Joe's lifetime guarantee just gave up.
All about quick.
Oh, Joe, we lost you a bit there. Can you hear me?
Oh, did you? Yeah. Where did you
We did.
Lose?
We lost you when you just said that the headquarters had stopped Domino Pizza Russia with their lifetime guarantee. Oh, you've stopped sharing now as well. Are you okay? Can you hear me? You're on mute, Joe, for some reason. I think your system must have had a blip. And that's better. Great. I can see you. I think I can hear you. Do you want to share your screen again and we'll pick up? Oh, you're back on mute.
Okay. I think we got a delay or something. 1 minute. It's fine. Okay. Can you hear me now?
Back. Yes, okay. I can. You need to share your screen again, and you just got to the bit about headquarters closing down Domino's Pizza's lifetime guarantee. Here you go.
Okay, good. So
take two.
Okay, is that good? Can you see it now?
It's
okay,
good.
So we're good. Right then. Yeah, so I guess the global office told Domino's Pizza in Russia to shut this down. So they shut it for 5 days. And what I love about this story is this company that's renowned for speed and this great, smooth, quick service, telling people this permanent scarring on their body and to doing it forever. It's such a perfect storm and shutting down after 5 days. But they're not the only company to do it. So America in the sort of late 80s, they said to everyone, they're going to introduce these AA passes and they're going to cost $250,000. And with an AA pass, you can travel anywhere you want in any class at any time free of charge. And so only 60, 70 people picked this up. But one guy who was a Wall Street broker at the time, he'd done some quick calculations in his head and he thought, I travel a lot. This is incredibly cheap. So he bought one of these AA air passes, and this one individual then racked up 10,000 flights, 10 million miles, and the American Airlines $21 million for one individual. The chairman at the time, after he retired, he said it was the single worst business decision the company ever made. It's live digital storage. I think it's fascinating in how short digital has been around. This company is 7 years old, right? And so what they're offering people is cloud service, essentially, where you buy a terabyte of this thing for $7,000, and then you can put all of your precious other digital items. Incredible offering in terms of how bizarre it is. And they also have this forever guarantee fund, which is throughout into the future. So the nitty-gritty. There's a fundamental problem I come up with when I start to introduce endings into businesses and talk to business people around endings. And it's this: meta the same problem as a precarious philosopher. proposed around death. He said, I am, death is not. If death is, I am not. Why should I fear something which can only exist when I do not? And metaphorically, that's the position we're in. The cult, and it's almost all of our, it is also a social problem. We have very little engagement as consumers at the end of the consumer life cycle because we believe it's possible. And those for the first things you need to do when you start designing ends is discuss with where do they see the end and this change in responsibility. So I put together this graphic to outline this. So in most sales cycles, you're going to have this normal cycle where there be a person will purchase something, back and just something, and then you'll go through this cycle, and that's similar whether it be digital, physical, or cycle of sales. There'll be this point which is anxious for of idling, where the customer is inactive, and it doesn't mean they're not believing they're going to make a second purchase or a next purchase. It's just that they've stopped and paused for a while, and at this point you usually put into retention techniques and you start triggering them and try and get a response and try and push a sale onto them. This only works for so long, and eventually you have to agree that there's an ending happening. And this is the point of discussion, is where does the end happen? And I can't do that for you. I can frame that conversation, but that's to happen, and it happens differently for every business. Now, in the work that I've been doing, I believe there's 8 different types of ending that the consumer experiences at the end of the consumer life cycle. And these step across service, digital, and consumer products. So we can break these down a bit. So if you think of a timeout type ending, in services, that would be something like a 2-week holiday, or in digital, a 1-year software subscription, or in products, you can look at it in terms of a sell-by date or a warranty period. If you think of something that's been exhausted, battery has been in, gems in Clash of Clans run out of. It's another characteristic. Task event completion. So lots of engagement around just one task. So a parcel being delivered in the, for example, use the most common one of these categories. And that most to this, which is like a broken or withdrawal experience. So the same thing happens in a consumer experience when something breaks, or a company goes bust, or they exit and maybe get acquired by another company. Fundamental change that they weren't in control with, they have experienced. Now, there's also some ones which we don't really recognize, and those are things like the lingering ending. So pensions, for example, are a common one, where you used to pay into a pension and you've forgotten about it, the company's been acquired, and it sort of becomes so distant over potentially decades that it becomes this very lingering background thing. But we also have that in terms of and becomes the lingering asset that Kondo ends up getting rid of for you. You also have it in data processing of your digital experience. Another one is proximity. Now, proximity and relationship with the service, product, digital product. So I've done that. I've moved from the UK, Sweden, and I've moved out the proximity of the BBC, for example. So I can't watch the BBC anymore. But it also happens when we move from one company to another in digital. For example, Apple moved to Android. So those type of things happen. Another one is cultural change. So you see this stuff around historic, nostalgic things. Maybe writing a letter isn't very fashionable anymore. But we can also see it a lot more recently with sort of where people have very polarizing opinions in politics, for example. A good example was Spotify's relationship with Josh Rogan, who they've got on their system now, on their platform. Josh Rogan then interviewed Alex, I can't remember his name, the far right broadcaster. And that was very volatile for a lot of people. It actually culturally pushed a lot of people away from Spotify and challenged their relationship with Spotify. So you can see these ends happening in a cultural sense sometimes. About success that all, and there's thousands of books being written about, is competition. Businesses talk about competitive endings all the time, and without acknowledging all of these other endings, the consumer experiences. Right. There's loads of emotion that goes on at the end of the consumer life cycle. So I just want to dig into some of these again. And we can reflect upon the stuff that we were talking about earlier, they're constantly connected to the rest of the experience through emotional triggers. That was an important aspect of how we design endings. There's lots of emotional. These are 5 different endings by academics, emotion, and the end of the consumer life cycle. So one which I think is amazing work is by a woman called Helen Rosa Barr, and she talks about role exit and the crack of doubt. And that's when you come to when you're in a job maybe, or actually quite commonly in relationships, you'll experience something that makes you just question your relation with that person or that job, and it starts a crack of doubt. And that happens a lot. There's also cognitive closure. One often fall into 2 categories, and that's ease, which is very quick, urgency tendency, and freeze one, which is the long-term, sort of like you want it permanent, a permanence tendency. I'm sure many of you have heard about emotional design and Don Norman's early work around that, and he talks about reflective design being a big component at the end of the consumer life cycle. And mood, memory, and congenance and dependence. So that's about how a memory is established at a certain point of that memory, and how at the end of the consumer life cycle can be very similar in terms of how the emotional context of that experience. And finally, for this one, it was peak end rule and Daniel Kahneman's work of the remembering self, experiencing self. So if I just quickly flick over these, and then I just want to put this on a map. So you can start to map this onto the end of the consumer life cycle. So it all starts with Helen Rosa Barr's work with a crack of doubt. Basically, that's the beginning of the end, and that's how I contextualize that. With seize and freeze, it really happens right at the end, and it starts to frame what type of ending you're going to have. The emotion stuff goes a lot, and it's to gravitate a lot more around that reflective design at the end. Mood congenance and dependence, those 2 things, they've had polar ends, stages of the consumer life cycle, one as an experience inside that place and one at the end. And similarly, peak end rule, peak and ends, says it all. Another section is that we go through at the going towards the end of the consumer life cycle. So you'll experience about acknowledging things, actioning things, observing things, settling things, the aftermath and rebirth of the consumer. So I'll through those. The crack of that about Helen Rosa Barr's work is this crack that starts, but companies which use it really well is price comparison. So you open up a crack of your consumer relationship. After which you might experience a period where both parties need to acknowledge that the end is going to happen. So this is the point where you might send the provider some sort of acknowledgement that you want to end it, or they might start to acknowledge it. There's a period where people need to take action. There's a point where we need to observe it so we know, we believe the end is happening. And we can see that in quite tangible sort of, you see things leads to a graphic. But in film, there's a thing called establishing shot at the beginning of a film, but there's also establishing sort of ending shot that's quite commonly used. And the common one people reference is the end of Planet of the Apes, when Statue of Liberty. And really the end of the process starts to get to the point of being settled. This is when everything's been changed. And that moment when you come out of incredible experience. It's not celebrated in any way, and it's a real lost opportunity for big airports, I think. I think it's a great example of settled. After the end, there's period aftermath. And this is a very emotional time for the consumer, and you can be emotionally positive or emotionally negative. This is the time where, when it's emotionally positive, you want to try and get good reviews on whatever thing you've created. But it's also a time to really shout online about how bad your product was. As emotions fade, there's a period of where people have they've washed away all of those bad emotions, and they can start to think about purchasing and doing something again. I'm just looking at the time, so I think I'm going to quickly skip through some of the other things. So there's a whole load of stuff I've done on integrating them into your process, so you work around how ends work with add. I can work on the sort of epic level or theme level, and then you can also work it into, works almost on 2 levels on Agile. Lean as well, you can put endings into your business model canvas. So can download off the UI. I can share some links later. Cyclical and stuff through, you can test endings through a sort of lean method. So you can also use it in the double diamond stuff, which you can build big ones up front and make it more strategic, but again, stuff down the bottom and with the deliver and develop stages. The third thing I think is vital, because very much bad measure product that we're doing is really interesting. There's stacks of things. Big companies have been doing this for years. A lot comes out of medicine and industries which have been around for a while. So telecoms actually do a lot around product risk or customer risks of leaving. So, and if you put that onto a chart of type of tangible type measuring processes and intangible and more specific ones to emotional ones, you can see it in a sort of chart like this. So things like a net promoter score is very much a thing where we've asked the customer to feed back emotionally. It's a very simple one, and I think it's actually quite useful. But other ones are actually far more risky and avert to endings. So one I want to bring up here is the Google Heart Framework. It's about happiness, engagement, adoption, retention, and task success. Now, if you are measuring an ending by these values, it's going to be really hard to design a good ending, because so much of that the measuring mechanism is built to refuse good endings. And we've got to avoid and got to think about those discussions when we use these type of tools and how loaded they are to endless consumption. I think one which is far more healthier and open is the OKRs, which allow a group of people to openly do something and start to write down objectives and then look at those key results, a different type of measuring principle, one which they can establish, which is targeted at the problem. Let's have a look at how you might design these stuff then. So designing for action at the end. This is the Mobus loop, and it tells consumers this thing is recycled. It means it has a potential. This little green, this little dot here, that's called the green dot. It's usually green, it should be green, but it's obviously black and white on some products. This doesn't actually say anything about recycling. What it says is that this company, Hein, has given money to a scheme which is a recycling scheme. It doesn't mean that this product's particularly recyclable, but it means that that company is invested in that scheme. And when we stuff that fails in that context, so this is by the Grocery Manufacturers Association of America, and they asked 2,000 people around identifying recycling symbols, and it was atrocious failure. Many no idea really what they mean. And I think this is a problem similar to the one I showed earlier about being actionable. You can't do don't. And these ones are similar. They have no common sort of, no common clarity about stuff. So I think what we need to do is have a lot more around those and don't recycle these things. Not so. And then you can linear a timeline, and it example period of time and a point where you'll experience consumption, and then it will drift back below the consumer, and the visible consumer will linger in the ground. So, for example, in this, a can of beans takes a year to man recycling year, and consumer experience 4 days, because that's how long you can keep them in the fridge, and you should consume them in 4 days. And once they're out of your time, they can linger in landfill for over years. And we can make this into a legacy number, is it? Legacy students time over landfill time equals a legacy number. That's the data of it. So 1 year for man, so that's a year, and it also has a sell by date for roughly the same time. 4 days for consumer experience to the consumer, and into landfill, and that's 50 years it can end up in landfill. And that's the data is from the Balance MB website. So if we put a level of tangibility onto the can of beans, I think that would be far more clearer to the consumer, the threat level of not recycling this type of product. So this one's 450 years. So looking back at the legacy number, if you take 12 months for this product equals 1 year, it's 4, and that's 450 years to landfill. So it's 1/450th of consumption time to landfill time. And lastly, glass. Glass is basically doesn't decay in landfill. It can last for potentially ever. So 1 million years is from the data I've got. And if we put that onto the model, the consumption time of this this bottle of liquid, which was it was like a concentrated squash for kids, it's a 1 million years times 12, because that's how long you can consume it for, and then 12 million years. Sorry, 1 times 12 million consumption to landfill. So it's actually a million years. It's a chronic thing. So you put that on your products. And this type of thing is really good to give an emotional clarity to the end of the process of having these other things. Right. And finally, this is the last thing we're going to do is pages. So memorialized pages have been around for a few years now, but it took Facebook like 7 years to recognize that people die and there's an ending to the product relationship. I think Google had a similar relationship with ending your relationship with Google, but now they're lots better. Memorialized pages have been received by consumers, and when someone dies, you can get their page memorialized. You have to provide the death certificate, etc., etc. And it's the biggest funeral parlor in the world now. 8,000 users are dying daily on Facebook. So that's a significant number of people. But let's put this onto a bigger, because there's one failure of memorialized pages, that they haven't got an aid. There isn't in time where they said in memorialized pages comes to it, time period like 10 years, or is this no one using it? Let's map this out a little. Facebook is 2.4 billion consumers at the moment or last year. Any bigger in an enormous way. So eventually a few years from now. And let's say some last year signed up and they were like the legal permitted age of 13 to sign up to that. They go through their life, 71 years, the life expectancy. At those periods of time, the amount of memorialized pages are going to get big, to the point where there's more memorialized pages on Facebook there is active users will die under its own weight of memorialized pages and no customers. And that's the end. Thank you very much. And that's the book. So I'm going to stop sharing. And
no, thank you. We had a few problems hearing every single word, I have to admit, but we let you keep going because it was fantastically intelligible. Joe kept a hilarious running commentary on chat, so thank you for that. But absolutely extraordinary presentation. Thank you so much. And so many things I could reflect on and ask you questions of. And I'm just having a quick look in chat in case there are some questions.
I can just from what they've said there. This was really. Oh, I'm sorry. I don't know what's. I've got a pretty good. I don't know what's.
It was okay. It was okay because the slides were absolutely superb and the narrative was absolutely brilliant. So thank you, Joe. I just think that. I don't know, you made me reflect how much of our design lives have been involved with innovation. And innovation is always about, you know, creating new, but we're never innovative about the end. And when I first saw your talk, it was a real shock, actually. But it's been, I really enjoyed you coming and talking to all our students and to everybody on YouTube as well. And I don't see any questions. Does anyone want to jump in and ask a question, or are we okay? You've just smashed it, Joe. They're speechless.
Okay, I can share the deck with everyone. I'll send you a link for the deck later. Send you a link for
Joe,
the.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks again, Clive. Everyone. And,
You're getting some nice comments in chat. Your goodbye is breaking up, so I think you better just go.
Okay.
Thanks, Joe. I'll drop you a message.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot.